Although there was plenty of stereotyping and exaggeration in travelers' claims about the South, particularly the idea that white Southerners were lazier than their northern counterparts, there was also more than a grain of truth in the allegation. Southerners, whether rich, poor, or in between, did enjoy more leisure time than their Yankee brethren, and unlike Northerners, they didn't feel guilty about it. One obvious explanation for this, of course, is the one that probably first popped into your head: slavery. But fewer than 5% of Southern whites owned any slaves. How did the rest of them get by without working too hard? Were they really as dirt poor as they appeared to many outsiders? Or were they living high on the hog? Historian Grady McWhiney wrote that the Old South, it must be understood, was not one big plantation. It was, for the most part, a vast wilderness, with relatively few cleared and planted acres, and with relatively few inhabitants, where cows and hogs and other livestock roamed the woods unattended. Of the Antebellum South's nearly 557 million total acres, fewer than 10% were improved in 1850, that is, cleared and under cultivation. This helps to explain why, in the words of historian Frank Owsley, herdsmen were a large and important element of the Old South. From the mid-18th century to the Civil War, they were the typical pioneers. Their abode extended from the Indian border back through the unsurveyed lands of the public domains and even into the thinly but permanently settled agricultural communities. They fell into two classes, especially in the lower South. The first were those on the cutting edge of the frontier, where Indians and game were plentiful, who engaged in hunting and trapping as their principal occupation and livestock grazing as a secondary pursuit. These people were constantly moving from place to place in search of better pastures and more game, including Indians, and they seldom built more than rude huts for their homes, and not infrequently dwelt a few seasons in open-faced camps. As a consequence of their semi-nomadic life, they engaged in agriculture only to the extent of growing their vegetables and enough corn to furnish their bread. The next class, who were the main body of frontiersmen, occupied the zone of unsurveyed lands at a reasonably safe distance from the Indian border. They were the genuine herdsmen. Livestock grazing was their chief occupation, and hunting and trapping were secondary. They built better and more permanent cabins, and many of them preempted a farm with the intention of acquiring title to it when the land was surveyed and put up for sale. They almost invariably cultivated considerable fields of corn, sweet potatoes, and vegetables. The inner edge of this group lived on the sparsely settled agricultural frontier where the lands had been surveyed and considerable portions sold. They usually owned land and were, more often than not, in a transitional stage from a grazing to an agricultural economy. Even after settling as farmers, they often employed cowboys to manage the herds on a public domain until the frontier retreated to a distance. Many frontiersmen passed through the three stages once described and finally settled as farmers and planters. Many others, however, grazed their cattle and hunted from one frontier to another until at last there was no frontier left except the great pine barrens and the broken and mountainous regions. Southern herdsmen were continuing the ancient patterns of a tribal, rural, pastoral culture dating back to centuries before the birth of Christ. Celtic culture, which disdained the art of farming, according to McWhiney. The free males were pastoralists who held great herds of cattle and hogs in common by tribes and reckoned wealth by the numbers of their animals. They have huge quantities of meat, especially fresh and salt pork, wrote the Greek philosopher Strabo. Their pigs are allowed to run wild and are noted for their height and pugnacity and swiftness. The Celts enjoyed lavish feasts and heavy drinking, instrumental and vocal music, hunting and fishing, poetry and oratory. Fast forward to the colonial and antebellum periods, and McWhiney tells us that open-range herding and the leisurely ways of the southern plain folk were simply the continuation in the Old South of traditions practiced for centuries by Celtic peoples. That the Celts, who left the British Isles in the 17th and 18th centuries, were so easily able to plant their customs and values in the antebellum South was largely a matter of timing. The traditional ways of the Celts were becoming obsolete in the modern Great Britain that was a-borning in the 18th century, and the Celts were in fact being forced to change their ways during that so-called Age of Improvement. But traditional Celtic modes of behavior were marvelously adapted to life on the southern American frontier. On the other hand, had the South been peopled by 19th century Scots, Welshmen, and Ulstermen, the course of Southern history would doubtless have been radically different. 19th century Scottish and Scotch-Irish immigrants did in fact quite comfortably fit into northern society. Significantly, the Irish, who retained their Celtic ways, did not. But only a trickle of the flood of 19th century immigrants came to the South. The ancestors of the vast majority of antebellum Southerners had arrived in America before the Anglicization of Scotland, Wales, and Ulster had advanced very far. Had those Celts who immigrated to the southern colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries stayed at home, most of them would have been forced to change, become more anglicized. But by migrating to such a relatively unsettled wilderness as the Old South, they managed to remain pretty much what they and their ancestors had always been. The Southern approach to livestock and agriculture was utterly alien to Northerners, who devoted more of their land to cultivation and usually produced their own food as well as a range of sellable items. McWhiney wrote, "This mixed farming, which seemed to suit the Yankee character, was hard work. It required the year-round effort of the whole family and left them little free time from their labors. Their animals had to be sheltered, fed, and cared for during the cold winter months. By contrast, the Southern system of raising livestock on the open range was simple and easy. Aside from marking or branding their animals, Southerners had little more to do than round them up in the fall and either sell them to a local buyer or drive them to market. One could even raise livestock without owning land." What many a Yankee or English observer viewed as indolence was just good work-life balance as far as Southerners and their Celtic ancestors were concerned. Again quoting McWhiney, "The open-range system of herding encouraged more than indifferent farming and a leisurely lifestyle. From the Celtic pastoral tradition emanated a whole network of interrelated customs and beliefs that separated Celts and Southerners from Englishmen and Yankees. Laziness and a lack of ambition were only part of that Celtic Southern tradition, which good Englishmen and Yankees deplored. Being lazy to Celts and Southerners did not mean being indolent, shiftless, slothful, and worthless. It meant being free from work, having spare time to do as they pleased, being at liberty, and enjoying their leisure. When a Celt or a Southerner said that he was being lazy, he was not reproaching himself, but merely describing a state of comfort. He suffered no guilt when he spent his time pleasantly, hunting, fishing, dancing, drinking, gambling, fighting, or just loafing and talking. He could not understand why anyone would work when livestock could make a living for him. Indeed, he doubted the sanity of people who labored when they could avoid it. Nor did he see any good reason to have more than he could eat or drink or wear or ride. I appreciate you spending some of your leisure time with me and hope you'll subscribe, hit the notification bell, and watch another video or two of mine if you have time. It really helps this little channel keep growing. We've just passed 2,000 subscribers at the time of recording, so thanks. Please hit the like button on your way out, and I'll see you in the next episode.